It is my pleasure to introduce our host for the keynote presentation this morning, Kathleen Volman. Kathleen is a critical care nurse specialist, educator, and consultant. She has published and lectured nationally and internationally on a variety of pulmonary, critical care, and healthcare acquired injury prevention. She has earned her nursing degree from Wayne State University and her master's in critical care nursing from California State University. She spent 13 years as a clinical nurse specialist for medical ICUs at Henry Ford Hospital. Currently, she's focused on creating empowered work environments for nurses through the acquisition of greater skills and knowledge. In 2009, Kathleen was inducted into the American Academy of Nurses. She is a dynamic speaker and a motivator, and we are pleased to have her serve as our moderator to showcase how 40 years of infection prevention have made a difference. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Kathleen Volman.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Good morning, everyone. How are you doing? Woo! Well, I've got to tell you, this is like a wow. It is such an honor for me to be standing on this stage and in a room full of so many difference makers. And we're going to have an exciting opportunity this morning to be able to celebrate and learn from some of the most influential leaders in our profession. We're going to have some candid conversation. It's going to be insightful. And there's going to be 12 of them. I like to call them the dynamic dozen that have made a huge impact over the 40-year existence of APIC. And however, it's not just about celebrating the past, it's also about highlighting some of our current difference makers. Many of you have had a profound impact on infection prevention, and we want to celebrate the now as well as the past. And we're going to tell some stories. How many like a good story? Yeah, and some of it's going to be through video, and others going to happen right here on the stage. Our first story comes from the northeast portion of our country, where a group of individuals really took on an enormous task. Let's listen to their story.
NICE is a combination of Northern and Southern New Jersey and the Department of Health.
But it stands for the Northeastern Infection Control Educators.
Well, we were challenged in 1989 by our state sanitarian
to provide education when CDC stopped providing basic infection control education.
In the first meeting that we had in an auditorium at my hospital at the time, there had to be about 80 of us.
And then it dwindled down to about 15 people.
And all of us are really crazy passionate about infection prevention.
And we put the program, the curriculum together based on the needs of the infection prevention is what was going on in the industry.
You know, we divided up the responsibilities and were assigned different things so that we could put this course together.
We're giving them a foundation.
They teach you all the basics, and they give you the strength or the courage.
And then they can go out and basically work in very different facilities because they know where to get the information if they don't understand it or they don't have it.
What we hope to do is to give them the tools to change the behavior of their staff when they go back to their facilities. And by changing behaviors, you're going to improve outcomes. And that's what we're all here for, make it better for the patient.
Once these ladies get on here, they really love what they do, they're really passionate about what they do, and they stay.
It's been very rewarding for those of us who are on the faculty to go out and see a young ICP who's taken the course and who's out there and loves it and really does the job. And that's the very rewarding part of the whole course.
And I think the impact has been an improvement in healthcare outcomes in the whole region.
But we don't make dollars and cents, but I think we save lives, and that's just what's really important.
The first one-week course, held in March of 1990, attracted 68 participants and has been held twice every year since then. Over the past 20 years, the group has trained more than 3,000 new IPs and includes attendees from across the U.S. as well as other countries.
I'm Marie Kasai.
My name is Ann Moore.
I'm Alita Ammon.
My name is Arlene Potts.
My name is Kathy Horn.
My name is Nancy Salaji.
I'm Winnie Caputo.
My name is Renee Fusco.
And I'm a difference maker.
I'm a difference maker.
And I'm a difference maker.
I am a difference maker.
And I'm a difference maker.
And I'm a difference maker.
And I'm a difference maker.
I am a difference maker and proud of it.
Woo! Now, clearly, that is a group of individuals that stepped forward to fill a gap and really made a difference in young infection preventionists' lives. So I'd like to thank NICE for allowing us to share their story and also for the difference that they've made. Just awesome. Well, this celebration has been in the planning stages for over a year, and I'd really like to give a shout out to Karen Hoffman and the program committee group, as well as the gang at APIC for what they've done in creating this event. We're going to reminisce a bit. We're actually going to re-experience, if you're as old as I am, it'll be a re-experience. If you're younger, it may be a first-time experience. Some of the music, the photos, and some of those cultural milestones that will take place. And it's really about a nostalgic trip of looking at American culture and infection prevention over a 40-year period. 4 decades, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. So it's about highlighting those decades and the contributions that the Dynamic Dozen have made, but it's also about wanting to inspire you. So as you hear their stories, I want you to really think and pick out those difference-making moments that these individuals had in their careers and think about yours and how you may be able to take some of those and move them into your career or ones you've already created. Now, these are individuals that you've learned from. You've seen them speak. You've read their articles. And they have had a huge impact in pushing us and helping us grow and also driving a safe healthcare culture for the patients and for ourselves. But they're not going to lecture this morning. They're going to convey some information, but it's going to be different. They're going to be talking from their hearts about their journey, what moved them, what possessed them to make these changes, and what drove them to over 4 decades of making a difference. So we're going to start with the 70s, but I have a question to ask you guys first. How many still like disco? All right. So let's go ahead and roll it and start with the 70s.
Years ago, the 1970s were in full swing. The Vietnam War, the energy crisis, the Watergate scandal, and the Iranian capture of U.S. hostages dominated national headlines. Personal computers were introduced, and competition to produce cheaper pocket calculators reached a frenzy when many models began to sell for under $100. Shag carpet, lava lamps, and leisure suits were all the rage. And you could buy and raise your own pet rock, if you could dig it. In healthcare, the broad issues sounded much like those of today. Medicare reimbursement, rising costs and efforts to control them, and workforce shortages. In 1972, when the Brady Bunch had stolen America's heart and consumers were just beginning their fight with the clock on their VCRs, a new association began in support of professionals who were fighting an unseen enemy. APIC was founded by a pioneer group of infection control nurses, as they were called then, who recognized the need for an organized approach to preventing healthcare-associated infections. The association's founding members chipped in $20 each and began planning the first APIC conference in Toronto in 1973 for less than the price of a calculator. While Fonzie was teaching Americans how to be cool, APIC was growing strong. As it grew, other pioneers surfaced as difference makers in the changing world of infection prevention in the 1970s. Among them were Barbara Russell, Dennis Mackey, and Robert Haley. Barbara Russell has been in attendance at all 40 APIC annual conferences. That's right. From Laverne and Shirley to Kim and Chloe, she's been involved in teaching and supporting APIC at the local, state, and national level. In the mid-1970s, Barbara and a few other Floridians recognized the need to establish a state group known as Florida Professionals in Infection Control. Barbara served as president of APIC in 1994, and she continues to have a profound impact on infection prevention as Director of Infection Prevention and Control at Baptist Hospital of Miami. In 1969, after graduating from University of Wisconsin Medical School and completing an internship at Harvard, Dennis Mackey began studying infectious diseases during a stint as an Epidemic Intelligence Service Officer at the CDC. Mackey was on the front lines during early work on CHG as a skin disinfectant and has been instrumental in surfacing the need for reducing devices as HAI risks. Currently, Dr. Mackey is professor of medicine at UW School of Medicine and Public Health, and he uses his experience and vast knowledge to educate the next generation of infection prevention professionals. Robert Haley was also a major influence on early infection prevention efforts. He began working at the CDC in 1973 and served as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Public Health Service. At the CDC, he served as director of the nationwide study on the efficacy of nosocomial infection, scenic. Robert has published over 100 articles in scientific journals and is currently professor of internal medicine and director of the Division of Epidemiology in the Internal Medicine Department at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center at Dallas. During the 1970s, when young people were infected with Saturday Night Fever, and Fred Sanford thought he was having the big one, these three difference makers were a profound part of an effort that helped America keep singing, Staying Alive.
And don't worry, we won't make them dance. Woo. Barb, I got to tell you, that sounds like it was a very exciting time with the birth of APIC. Could you tell us a little bit more about that journey?
I would love to. My journey began around the same time APIC did. My friend Lonnie Kicklighter, who you heard mentioned before, convinced me I wanted to go into infection control. I wasn't really convinced at the time because when I went to school, I said, I am never going to have anything else to do with infectious diseases. This is it. I am so glad she made me do that, and she became my mentor. She eventually left infection control, and now she's back in it, and now I'm her mentor. So you see, it does go around. But when we started, the groups had started all over the country meeting and getting together because they were anxious for networking and information. So groups met, which eventually became APIC chapters, and after this meeting occurred in Research Triangle, things really started going, and as was mentioned, the first conference was in Toronto in 1973. And there were some of us from Miami that even traveled up there, and now have been to every one since. The next conference was in 1975 in Chicago. And in those days, they used to have special events on Wednesday night. And the one in Chicago was a lovely dinner. And what the Chicago chapter had done was they put a little ladybug pin at every plate. And that was the beginning of the connection for those of us that are into the ladybugs and men to buy things with ladybugs on it. Also, back in the 70s, as we started having annual conferences, in reality, the local chapter did basically everything with some support from the then management company. And in 77, when the first one was in Florida, and it didn't rain that time, Dottie Thomas, my lifelong friend who I met through APIC and is rooming with me as we speak, and another Floridian were the co-chairs of it, and I was in charge of exhibitors. It was the first time there was exhibitors at the conference. I think we had maybe tops 40, I can't remember the exact number. And now today, it's what? It's in the hundreds. which we need their support, and it's been wonderful that we've been able to grow that as well. So it's been a journey through all the conferences, and I continue to come because of the networking and seeing old friends. And people say, what can you learn at this point? You can always learn something. And the important thing is to volunteer. I learned more through my volunteer efforts probably than I did some sessions I went to. And I don't care whether you're a newbie, if you've been in it 3 weeks, or if you've been in it 30 years, please volunteer for something. That's what keeps things going, and you'll hear more about that as we go through the time.
Well, my understanding is you also know these two gentlemen
yes,
up on stage with you.
You know, that's another wonderful thing of going through the years and growing up with them through infection control. You know, and when you go to a meeting or a session or something, even in your own facility with doctors and folks, and they quote Dr. Haley or they quote Dr. Mackey, and you can sit there and say, yes, I know them. And it kind of goes over their head. They kind of look at you, and then I'll say, no, I know them. I know who they are. And so it has been fascinating. Obviously, many more people that you'll hear through the rest of the morning, as well as a lot of you out there. It's been a great trip, a great journey to know you, and I still look forward, even though I don't know what comes after Kim and the sisters, but I continue to stay involved.
Well, I've got to tell you, it sounds like it has been an amazing journey. And what's so exciting about this is that it truly demonstrates what a group of individuals can do,
right,
and how that can last for generations.
Right. And you know, in the opening was also mentioned about our state group. That even though APIC was forming, there was a group of us in Florida that felt that, you know, we are unique down here. We don't push our buttons through and all that kind of stuff. So we felt we were unique enough that we needed to get something else going for us on a state level. All of us are members of APIC, but yet we still formed our state group and have made great progress in the state of Florida with working with our legislators and doing educational programs and all.
Which is awesome.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, Robert, that you're one of those individuals whose work really set the foundation for why we do surveillance in hospitals today. Would you be able to share how you got started with that?
Yeah, I joined the hospital infections branch at CDC in 1973. I was 28, right out of my internal medicine residency at Parkland in Dallas. And when I came to CDC, joined the hospital infections program, we had just gone from 4 EIS officers to 5. Had a nurse consultant, Julie Garner, who was a veteran. The 1970 First International Conference had just occurred. NIST was just getting started, and our job was to work on NIST on a regular basis, but then investigate epidemics in hospitals primarily, and do a little teaching. And but the future of infection control and surveillance measurement in hospitals was anything but a foregone conclusion. It was controversial. I remember Julie Garner told me in the 1970 International Conference 3 years earlier, one of the august physicians at this event, in a heated moment of debate about the future of infection control, said to Julie publicly, the only surveillance you're going to be doing in the future is at the checkout line in the grocery store. How far we have come. But it was controversial whether you should measure, whether you should do surveillance, measure the overall hospital infection rate and so forth. That's what primarily was going on at the time. CDC had the little brown Julie, if you remember, the surveillance manual. And so it occurred to us sitting around in our annual program review that there really needed to be a study to determine whether this works or not before CDC continues to recommend this nationally. And so we sent this up to the director in the annual program review and came back with a very strong agreement from Dave Sensor, who was the director of CDC. And he said, you know, with eventually the tightening of finances in hospitals, there's going to come a day that if we don't have evidence whether this works or not, infection control programs and surveillance will eventually be cut out as extraneous unless there's evidence that it works. And so our job was then to find a director, somebody who would design such a program and do it. And we sat around, and I remember my initial reaction was, hey, this wouldn't would not only be difficult to design, it would be logically impossible. I was a philosophy major, so it was logically impossible, because in order to measure the effect of surveillance, you'd have to have a control group with no surveillance. But then how could you measure the outcome? So I said, no, don't count on me. So I went and tried to talk one of my buddies into it and talked myself into it. So with Julie Garner and Grace Amori, Mac Hooten, Dennis Schauberg, and others, we designed this study. We put it in the field. We had hundreds of data collectors, did a survey of all U.S. hospitals, and then picked a random sample of about 400 and sent people in to measure their infection control programs, and then sent another group of medical records professionals in to review records, random samples of records, and measure the infection rates over 5 years, and then related the change of infection rates to what kinds of infection control programs. And we found, sure enough, that hospitals that did surveillance had reduced their infection rates more. Those that had active control activities, policies, programs, and so forth had lower infection rates. And those that had an infection control preventionist per 250 beds, an FTE, were more effective. And those that had a hospital epidemiologist who had had a training course in infection control were more effective. And so we then published that, and it's had an impact.
Well, actually, I wanted to ask, what long-term impact do you think the scenic study had, or that foundational work?
Well, first of all, by showing this, the Joint Commission then changed their recommendations to require these elements of an infection control program. And I remember in about 1978, when we just first had the data, we realized that most of these things weren't really in place in many hospitals. And so we thought, we had an activity called After Scenic What? And we envisioned a number of changes. One, by that time, EIS officers and hospital infections were answering 10,000 phone calls and letters a year. And we thought, why don't we write this stuff down? And so that was the origin of the guidelines.
Okay.
And then in terms of surveillance, we decided we better replace the brown Julie with something more organized. And so we had developed a whole new set of definitions for scenic that then we morphed into more practical definitions. We had a multivariate index, a patient risk index that became the NIST risk index with some modification, and now an NHSN index, so you could compare your rates to other hospitals. And then in the control aspect was the guidelines. And then the training, there was no course for hospital epidemiologists, for physicians. So out of this came the SHEA CDC training course for physicians that has been going on year after year. But I think overall, just having the evidence, that was the first evidence that any kind of quality improvement program of any kind works. And it's still among the only evidence in controlled studies that quality improvement works. And by having that, then when Joint Commission came, we had evidence to say, here's what you need to do. When Medicare came along and wanted to have something in Medicare, there was evidence of what works. And of course now with research, as the world of science goes, we're now 20 generations beyond that, and we don't even remember scenic, but that's the way science goes.
But it sounds like scenic also really kind of started the process of surveillance of device-related infections.
Yeah, in fact, one of the things in analyzing the scenic data, we noticed that if you look at each site of infection, urinary tract infections, surgical site infections, and pneumonias, and so forth, that a different mix of infection surveillance and control activities were required to be most effective for each one of those. It wasn't just one type of surveillance with a capital S, like overall surveillance. And that led then, in fact, I gave the keynote address at the APIC convention that year, talking about we've got to get away from overall hospital infection rates to targeted infection surveillance, to target surveillance at each type of infection, including.
Okay. Well, and Dr. Mackey, or Dennis, my understanding is that you were part of this foundational journey. Could you share how you got started in this journey?
Well, like many things in life, my career was very serendipitous. There were some pretty bad things that occurred from the Vietnam War, but one of the very positive things was that we were all drafted. All the male members of my generation, all of my medical school classmates, we were all drafted. And for reasons that took me decades to find out, I got sent to the CDC rather than one of the arms of the uniformed services. And they sent me to the EIS. I'd never heard of the CDC. I had little or no interest in infectious disease, and I was oblivious to infection control. And I arrived at CDC, and they sent me on an epidemic intelligence outbreak to solve an outbreak. And it was a Serratia outbreak. And Dr. Bennett said, I'm sending you down to Florida to solve the Serratia outbreak at the Veterans Hospital in Miami. I said, what's Serratia, Dr. Bennett? He said, you better go to the library for a couple of days. And but to make a long story short, the CDC was an extraordinary experience. It changed the life of most of us that were there. Dr. Haley, I'm sure, found his career from CDC. I found my career. I was going to be a cardiac surgeon. I was going to go back to Boston, finish my training, do cardiac surgery. And at CDC, they assigned me to the hospital infections branch. I was not very happy about it initially. And then a huge epidemic came on, the epidemic of the 1970-71. Probably 15,000 to 20,000 patients in American hospitals got gram-negative bacteremia. And 15% of them died as a direct consequence. Right. And I had the opportunity to play a major role in the investigation of that outbreak, and it was a heady experience. And made me realize patients are vulnerable to bad things in hospitals. And I really realized how oblivious I'd been to that in my training up to that point in time. I was just totally oblivious to the concept of hospital safety. We were just going to take care of patients. And it really was a career-changing experience. And I finished my training. I went back to Boston to finish internal medicine residency and decided to do ID fellowship training. And one long weekend, sort of a quiet weekend on call, I wrote a draft of the first guideline on prevention of Lyme sepsis. It's published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. And it was interesting. I laugh when I call it an evidence-based guidelines because we didn't have much evidence. We extrapolated what we learned from the Abbott epidemic, and we then also put together everything we could find, and it was really the first guideline, and it was widely accepted, and it's gone through many iterations since. It's full of evidence now. Almost everything that we do to prevent Lyme sepsis has been based on studies. And I finished my training, went to the University of Wisconsin, had the wonderful experience of building an ID division, establishing a research-oriented infection control program, and working with some extraordinary people such as Carla Alvarado, Rita McCormick, who taught me far more than I ever could have dreamed. They had such wisdom and such insights. And it's been a long, fascinating ride. What I'd like to say is how much I've appreciated being able to participate in this session. I have revered APIC for my entire career. If we look at what's happened in infection control in the world in the last 40 years, it started in the 70s, and we had the good opportunity of being here when it started. And the decade of the 70s focused on surveillance, defining the problem, and beginning to put together guidelines. In the area of the 80s was big on guidelines and studies to find what measures will reduce risk. In the areas of the 2000s really has been, it's not enough to know what to do. We have to know how to make it happen. And we have to develop systems that are fail-safe if we want to really maximize safety. And I laugh when we talk about the hospital safety movement as though it was discovered in 1999, 2000. Hospital preventionists have been doing hospital safety for 40 years. Mm-hmm. And that's been the fact. And infection control would not happen without you. APIC has been the organization that has made it happen at the grassroots level. We can have all the knowledge, but if we can't apply it and make it happen, our patients aren't going to do well. And this organization has really been in the forefront of that effort. Thank you.
Well, Dennis, I want to thank you for sharing your story. And it really puts out a point that sometimes serendipity, fate, leads us to different directions, and being open, all of you being open to that, and taking that experience and impacting for generations to come. So let's give it a rock for our 70s. Woo! And we're now going to roll, because we got to move the decades along, right? Hang here, Barb. We're going to roll the 80s.
The decade of the 1980s created a lot of questions in American culture. From who shot JR to where's the beef, Americans were curious about everything from space travel to time travel. But the 1980s also made a lot of statements. Madonna and MTV, Chernobyl and cats, the Tylenol murders and the discovery of the Titanic, Rubik's Cube and the Ropers, Farm Aid and the fitness craze. It was a time for fear, a time for the fall. Oh, and it was also time to make the donuts. In healthcare, the World Health Association certified that smallpox had been eradicated, and the use of new technology accelerated, including personal computers and telemedicine. The AIDS epidemic began when the first cases of HIV were reported to the CDC by doctors in San Francisco and New York City. Since there was no known cause or prevention at the time, public fears about AIDS grew quickly. Those fears were echoed in hospital workers. Hospitals began developing treatment protocols for caring for AIDS patients while ensuring the safety of the staff and other patients. While America was infatuated with both Reagan's Star Wars and Lucas's, and the public was taking a step back from those who were ill, Marguerite Jackson, Julie Gerberding, and Barbara Sewell stepped up. In the mid-1980s, Marguerite Jackson and Pat Lynch realized that hepatitis B was being transmitted by the undiagnosed patient, and that a diagnosis-dependent isolation system did not protect healthcare workers from bloodborne organisms. This led to a new system of isolation called body substance isolation, as an alternative to the diagnosis-driven isolation system that was in place. The use of gloves was implemented whenever a healthcare worker had potential contact with blood or other body substances. Marguerite is currently retired from the University of California San Diego Health System. In the 1980s, Barbara Sewell began practicing and teaching infection prevention and control and healthcare epidemiology in the U.S. and throughout the world, consulting with health systems, individual organizations, and ministries of health. Barbara published extensively in the area of infection prevention and served as the editor-in-chief of the APIC curriculum, which would later become the APIC text. She worked in acute care organizations in a variety of capacities and served as director of infection control and epidemiology for 25 years. Barbara was APIC president in 2003 and continues to be a leader in the infection prevention effort as practice leader of infection prevention and control services for Joint Commission Resources and Joint Commission International. The AIDS epidemic in the early 1980s placed Julie Gerberding on the front lines of HIV care at the University of California at San Francisco. Dr. Gerberding saw firsthand how this frightening new disease made it difficult for some healthcare workers to care for patients. That motivated her pioneering research in occupational infections, which defined the risk of HIV transmission through needle sticks, the scientific basis for double gloving, and the value of post-exposure antiviral prophylactics. She established the UCSF Prevention Epicenter to integrate research, teaching, and lab research in healthcare-associated infections, and became the SFGH healthcare epidemiologist before she moved to head the hospital infections program at the CDC. Dr. Gerberding continues to make a profound impact on infection prevention as president of Merck Vaccines. In the 30 years between Dynasty and Duck Dynasty, a lot has changed in culture and infection prevention. Cell phones and bangs got smaller, while TVs and hard drive capacities got bigger. The Dukes of Hazzard went from the good old boys to just the old boys, but Julie Gerberding, Barbara Sewell, and Marguerite Jackson made lasting impacts as difference makers who brought new meaning to the title, The A-Team.
Julie, I wanted to ask you, from the knowledge here, we know that your clinical training actually started or was in the middle of the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. How did that influence your decision to move into infectious disease? And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about that story.
You know, it's really hard to go back and think of what it was like when we didn't know what it was. All of my patients were dying. They had pneumocystis, they had cryptococcal meningitis, they had lymphoma, and they were dying, and we didn't know it was an infectious disease. So in the very beginning of HIV, I was an intern, and we were up all night with these deadly viruses around us and didn't even realize that we were potentially at risk ourselves. It was also a very sad time because as people caught on to the fact that this was an infection, they became very frightened and many stopped providing care. It wasn't just our patients, it was our hairdressers, our neighbors, our faculty. Everybody in San Francisco was affected by AIDS, so you really couldn't train there and not step up. And I think it was that process of just recognizing that it is what it is, and we had to roll up our sleeves and figure out how we were going to cope with it that really made me feel like I needed to do something. And I wasn't going to be a lab scientist, and I wasn't going to be the person to discover the vaccine, but there was something that I could do to contribute to the solution. And I realized when I got hepatitis B on the job and the CDC had just come out with a guideline that said, healthcare workers, don't worry so much about AIDS, it's transmitted like hepatitis B, that there was an occupational issue. And I think it was that personalization of the risk that convinced me that prevention was an area where I wanted to commit my career, and HIV prevention as an occupational infectious disease in the context of a city hospital like San Francisco General that had so many nosocomial infections, that I just became convinced that my contribution would be in the field of infection prevention, and one thing led to another, and here I am.
And we were actually talking, I practiced as a critical care nurse in the Los Angeles area in the mid-'80s and experienced some of that isolation of patients to where nobody wanted to go into the room. There was so much fear. So thank you for stepping up. And also I wanted to ask, how has that helped in today's kind of addressing epidemics and how we manage that? Where's the translation?
HIV was a tipping point because prior to HIV, the dogma in the infectious disease world was that infectious diseases were going to be a thing of the past. We had vaccines, we had antibiotics, we were cautioned, don't go into that profession, it's a dead-end street. And then HIV happened, and there was an awakening that infections do emerge. And I think that knowledge now is something that we live with every day, but there was a time when we didn't understand, and that's probably why it took so long to recognize that it was in fact an infectious disease that we were experiencing in the city. So, that concept of we're all in this together, infections do emerge, they spread very quickly, and I think a part of that is when something's happening that has a population health impact of the scale that an outbreak has or a pandemic has, as much as we want to be about the science, we don't always have the answers. Mm-hmm. And so we have to be able to learn as we go. And in HIV, we didn't have the science around what was the effective infection control, or we didn't have the science around post-exposure prophylaxis, but we had to use what we did know and adapt that logic and that information as we went forward. I think there's something that's just so true about people in APIC, that yes, we want to be science-based, but when we don't have the science, the next best thing is to use common sense.
Logic.
And so, sometimes
as they say, it's not so common anymore, right?
And I just think it's that practical application of what we do know and some reasonable assumptions about what we don't know that really have been part of the HIV legacy, but really continue today in all of our infection prevention work, and really in all of our public health related to infectious diseases.
That's awesome. Marguerite, I wanted to ask, I was curious how you and Pat Lynch came up with the BSI system, or as it's called, the body substance
body
isolation.
Isolation
yeah.
System. Yes. In about 1982, Pat and I were working together with several other infection control nurses, as we were called back in those days, with a CDC project called Management Skills. So we were getting to know one another. And an article came out in the American Journal of Epidemiology that showed, it was done in Boston City Hospital by Dean Stagg and Ryan, and it showed that a third of the emergency room nurses at Boston City Hospital had serologic evidence of hepatitis B. Now, a third of ER nurses with hepatitis B markers was a lot. That's a lot. Out of a total number of healthcare workers sampled of about 650. And we started thinking about it, and we said, what is it about the emergency room that would make these nurses get hepatitis B? Well, back in those days, nurses didn't wear gloves. Nurses did not wear gloves. There was a psychosocial belief in the nursing school curricula that gloves would make your patients feel bad. And if you wore gloves, you were to hide your hands so that the patient did not feel rejected. Furthermore, in a busy emergency room like Boston City Hospital, who were the first responders when the gunshot wound came in bleeding copiously through the door? It was usually the ER nurses barehanded. And that made us think that the traditional isolation system that triggered on a diagnosis to get the cart, to put the sign on the door, and to make people behave in a different way wasn't working. The CDC had given people the opportunity in their guidelines to use the traditional system or to use another system. They were not mandatory to do anything a particular way. So we took that opportunity to use the epidemiologic model of the iceberg, where the diagnosed case is above the waterline and the undiagnosed case is below the waterline, and to develop the concept of body substance isolation. We called it that because it's hard to say blood, urine, stool, sputum, all things wet and wonderful that come out of real and man-made holes. So we coined the term body substance isolation, and the short of which was BSI. We had a lot of people, particularly nurses, really get into it because we said it trigger your behavior, whether you wear gloves, whether you cover your clothing, on the interaction that you're going to have with the patient. What are you going to do for the patient? Are you likely to have a body substance exposure? If yes, protect yourself, and at the same time, you're protecting other patients you take care of subsequently. And hand washing, of course, was a given as part of this. And we developed this system. It was published first in 1984 in the American Journal of Nursing. Not a whole lot of people in infection control read the American Journal of Nursing, so it took a while for it to catch on, but it caught on, and universal precautions came along in 87, 88, specifically targeted at HIV, and the two together melded together over time to become what we now know as standard precautions.
Well, and I've got which is awesome, by the way. Yes. I've got to ask, was something so radically different than what previously people have been doing, how did you and Pat get people to adopt something so different?
Well, Pat and I both had the good fortune of working in academic medical centers. I was at the University of California in San Diego. She was at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. And we had administrators who were very interested in new things. That's what academic medical centers do. We had infection control committees who were willing to take the risk to make a change because we presented an epidemiologic rationale for why this made sense. And we implemented it at UCSD in about 83, 84. Pat implemented it at Harborview at the same time and actually studied it very systematically and had a landmark study published in Annals of Internal Medicine in 1987. So we went out, we were passionate about this concept. We did workshops, we talked at APIC. Wherever we could get an audience, we told people. Julie knew about it. Julie was a believer. And Julie and I worked together in California many years. And so that's really how it came to be.
Well, and I'm wondering, were those epidemiological principles in the first APIC curriculum that you developed, Barb?
Yes, we had a whole chapter on epidemiology and statistics. The body substance isolation wasn't published yet, so it wasn't in there, but the foundation and the thinking was in there. Yes.
Wow. And so in the development of that, what prompted to actually create that curriculum, and what impact do you think that curriculum had then and now?
You know, in the early 1980s, our profession was still very young. Our science was still quite young and evolving, as it continues today. And we really didn't have a framework for consistent practice. We were very happy, those of us in the field, to have the CDC guidelines, to listen to some of our wonderful forward-thinking physicians and nurses who were starting to break barriers and so forth, but we didn't have something that everyone could follow. So the board of directors of APIC asked the certification committee to provide them with standards that they thought, areas of knowledge and practice that they thought every infection preventionist should be able to master to practice well in the field. So in 1979, the certification committee presented 8 standards to the board, and the board accepted them. So then the board said, okay, now we need content to go with these standards. And they gave that task to the education committee. So I happened to be serving on the education committee at the time, and Sandy Pfaff, some of you may know her, called me up. She was the chair, and she said, "You're going to lead this project." She didn't ask me, she just told me. So I said, okay. And we envisioned this as maybe a 30 or 40-page outline, kind of similar to what the critical care nurses had. We used that as one of our models. Well, as you all know, it morphed and evolved into a 1,000-page, 2-volume production. That was the first curriculum, and then a 3rd volume that came out a little bit later. So we had all these discussions about, should we put this material in? Okay, put it in. No, take it out. We don't need that. We went back and forth all the time. So we did a tremendous amount of editing. And I'll just bet you there's some of you in the audience that have never worked on a typewriter. But I'm here to tell you that 3,000 pages of manuscript were done on the typewriter. And we read every one. So you know the term cut and paste? Yeah, we literally would cut out paragraphs, throw them out, paste something new in, put white out on, recopy it, and so forth. And spell check was here in your eyes. So it was really quite a production. And I want to just acknowledge that we had a team of 10 editors and about 50 contributors. And some are in the audience today. So I want to acknowledge Carol O'Boyle, who was vice chair of the committee, and I know Dottie Thomas is here, who was our pediatric expert, and maybe Gail Bennett, because she usually comes. But we had Dr. George Counts, Dr. Frank Rame, Mary Yarbrough from California, who was our administrator, Pat Hinson, our educator. So we had a wonderful team and great authors. As soon as we released the curriculum, it was used all over the world. And people, our colleagues in the global community, were just hungry for knowledge. And they were so thankful to have this document, which was really intended to be for your personal, professional growth, a daily resource, help you design educational programs, help you prepare for certification. I mean, the board gave us a very tall order. And now, that first document, which we love, Marguerite, by the way, was the associate editor, and her husband was our technical editor. Everybody volunteered thousands of hours of their time, and everybody had full-time jobs. So we met on the weekends, we would fly in, have a meeting, work furiously for 48 hours, fly back home, do our drafts, and so forth. So it was a work of love. Anyway, now it has evolved into our wonderful APIC text, which is in the 3rd edition now, and is continued to be used all over the world by our colleagues. So APIC has done a wonderful thing for the profession by creating these documents.
Well, it sounds like, yes, absolutely. Well, I got some major messages out of here, but one is it takes a village.
Takes a village.
Takes a village to make things happen. And clearly the 70s and 80s served as a real foundation builder to what was to come in the next decade. So I'd like to thank our 1980 difference makers. And we're gonna roll to the 90s.
The 1990s saw incredible change in almost every aspect of American culture. By the time Bill Clinton was sworn in as the 42nd president in 1993, Vanilla Ice had given us Ice Ice Baby, Seinfeld had given us a show about nothing, and a man named Tim Berners-Lee had given us the public World Wide Web, although others would take credit for it. America grew by almost 33 million people during the 1990s, the largest increase of any decade in history. While Will Smith was getting jiggy with it, and George Clooney, aka Dr. Doug Ross, was running the nation's most popular ER, real-life healthcare was a hot topic on the legislative calendar, and talk of healthcare reform permeated the halls of Congress. By the end of the 1990s, more than 280 million people were living in the United States, and the population was getting older, which added to the nation's healthcare costs. Murphy Brown, Bart Simpson, and the Spice Girls may have been influencing fashion, creating catchphrases, and making up words, but Richard Wenzel, Elaine Larson, and Carla Alvarado were impacting healthcare in ways that are still being felt 20 years later. Richard Wenzel has used his career to fight infectious disease, sometimes one patient at a time, and sometimes on a global scale, through his textbooks, scientific publications, and offering counsel to international health agencies. The professor and former chair of the Department of Internal Medicine at Virginia Commonwealth University Medical Center, Wenzel is also a past president of the International Society for Infectious Diseases and has authored more than 480 scientific publications, including 6 textbooks and a book of essays in medicine. Dr. Wenzel was an important part of the changes in infection prevention during the 1990s, and his impact continues today. Elaine Larson, recently quoted in the New York Times as the hand-washing expert, has been a loyal APIC member since the 1980s and is committed to the merging of science and the clinical practice of infection prevention and control. She is currently the Associate Dean for Research and Anna C. Maxwell Professor of Nursing Research at Columbia University School of Nursing. She has authored more than 250 journal articles, 4 books, and a number of book chapters in the areas of infection prevention, epidemiology, and clinical research. Dr. Larson's research in hand hygiene and compliance have put her at the forefront of the implementation science movement to promote better health and healthcare. In the 1990s, she served in multiple APIC leadership roles, including being appointed editor of the American Journal of Infection Control, where she continues to lead the charge in dissemination and implementation science for infection prevention and control. Carla Alvarado has served as an infection control professional for 19 years at the University of Wisconsin Hospitals and Clinics, after receiving her MS in Preventative Medicine Epidemiology and her PhD from the university. Dr. Alvarado is well known for her publications and research in nosocomial infections associated with medical devices, safety culture, safety climate, intensive care, and healthcare-acquired infections, as well as hand hygiene. She has served on the APIC Board of Directors, been a member of the American Hospital Association Technical Advisory Panel on Infections in Hospitals, and a member of the Board of Trustees for the Research Foundation for Complications Associated with Healthcare. Dr. Alvarado continues her impact on healthcare as a research scientist emerita at University of Wisconsin Center for Quality and Productivity Improvement and UW School of Medicine and Public Health. The 1990s were a time for growth. America experienced more changes than Ross and Rachel's relationship, and healthcare changed with it. The television public was obsessed with being a millionaire, and Carla Alvarado, Elaine Larson, and Richard Wenzel were making sure that the current battle for patient safety was not healthcare's final answer.
Dick, I wanted to ask you, I saw on there microbe smasher, yes. Yeah. You have really in your career impacted one patient at a time, but also that global impact. And so I'd like you to share a little bit about that journey.
Sure, I was very fortunate. My whole career, I've been very lucky, surrounded by talented people, particularly a large group of fellows. And the 1990s was an awesome period of opportunity for me. I think what made it really exciting was the wonderful fellows that I had, first of all, our emphasis on a high-performance team, and then the emphasis also on communication. Let me expound a little bit. So we had fellows from all over the world, and I'd love to tell you I selected them, hand-selected them, as with all the nurses I've also trained. But the truth is our field selects for talent, highly driven people. They're high achievers. And I was very fortunate as I was building a knowledge base for people to read about, as well as textbooks. Along the way, I think it's really important, as we had people from Mexico. I remember walking down the street and seeing Sigfrido Rangel from Mexico, Mike Edmond from West Virginia, Didier Pate from Geneva. I said, I'm not sure this is going to work. But in fact, they're wonderful friends, in part because of the intense time they spent together. We'd have 7 to 10 fellows at a time. And we'd work hard, we'd play hard. They weren't competing with each other. Each one had, they were working on a degree, master's degree in epidemiology. They all had an epidemic they were working on. And additionally, they all had a problem in the hospital that they were working on a research project. So I thought, well, they'll work hard, they'll play hard. And I thought, well, they live intensely, 8, 10, 12 hours a day. And we'll also try to have some parties where we'll get together. One of the early experiences, I learned something. So I said, well, we'll have a party. We'll bring about 100 people, the nurses, the lab people, administrators, and for fun, we'll have a karaoke. And because we have a lot of talent. And so I thought, well, this will be good. The talented people will be there. Well, the karaoke lady surprised me. So she got up and said on the announcement, well, we're very fortunate. Dick Wenzel's going to do the first song. Well, I have an acoustic guitar and I sing, but to be fair, my voice is like Bob Dylan with a respiratory infection. And so I knew I was in trouble. So she says, and we've selected him to sing a song, Daniel. Well, she pushed the button, and it was a key that I couldn't hit if I was 11 years old, So I knew I was in for a little trouble. I said, what the heck, 2 verses, I can survive this. Well, about verse 3, 100 people were pointing at me. And then they were guffawing by 5, and I had never seen those words before. And by verse 7, they were tears rolling down their eyes, looking at this. And I thought, oh my God, I survived this. But there was something good that happened as the fellows got to know me as a real person. So later on, one of the things I think was important was just the emphasis on communication. And as we see in the audience here, most infection practitioners, you were women. Half of my fellows were women, but half were men. And they hadn't worked a lot with women. And many of the hospital administrators were women. So one well-meaning fellow came up to me and he said, I just spent 45 minutes talking to an administrator, and I don't think she understood anything. I used all the logic, hard arguments, but I got a kind of a cool reception. I said, well, let me put it this way, there are a lot of paradoxes in life. Remember the first philosophy course you taught? You went to? There was this old conundrum. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one around to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, the new version is, if a man walks in a forest by himself and expresses his opinion and there's no woman around to hear it, is he still wrong? So, so it turns out there were some flaws in his presentation anyway. The point was, to listen more and do more. So if I were to summarize, I'd say we're very fortunate. The field selects for talent. And I had 50 fellows. We've trained, thousands of nurses. And I think I was the lucky one. In terms of playing hard and working hard, I really believe in high-performance teams where you live together intensely. And if you want to reference Katzenbach and Smith, The Wisdom of Teams, where I learned a lot about how important time together is. Now, it helps to get a singing lesson here and there, That'll go without saying. And then a lot of emphasis on communication.
Well, and I think Elaine is one of those women. Can you tell us about your early research and publications around hand hygiene?
Sure. Actually, I want to start with an anecdote that I actually had cited in 1997 for my Carol DeMille Award. And it struck me when I read this in a newspaper. It was a 75-year-old woman who had been taunted all of her married life by her husband, who bragged about how many women he'd had and what a stud he was and how attractive he was. And he was then in his 80s and infirm, and she was his caretaker. But he kept taunting her, and finally, apparently, she'd had it. This was actually in the newspaper I read. And so she beat him to death with his plastic bedpan. So I thought about that, and I thought, you know, it's not a nice thing she did, but you got to admire her inventiveness. And often in infection prevention, I feel like we have to use tools in different ways and in new ways. And so, you know, that segs very well into hand hygiene. In the 1980s, I think it was, CDC actually wrote a short first guideline about hand hygiene, but then they kind of went out of the business of writing guidelines for a while. And so when I went on to school to get my doctorate, in the epi department, I told them that I wanted to do my research on hand hygiene, and my advisor said, well, you can't. It's not epidemiology. There's no research we need to do. We know all the stuff we need to know. So I was able to sort of articulate enough of a rationale so that they allowed me to do some research on that. And in the mid-1990s, we published the first paper that I know of in North America on using alcohol instead of a traditional surgical scrub. Well, at that time, I never in a million years thought that things would change, because hand washing was kind of like a holy grail, and we talked about it a lot. I'm not sure we ever really did much about it, but we talked about it. Anyway, so the group I remember that was the most critical of that idea was the infection prevention group, us. And I was very worried at the time. It was kind of risky because I was getting a lot of criticism. And the criticism was, well, if we start using alcohol hand sanitizer, nobody will wash their hands. And I'm thinking, yeah, if it's better, it's okay. And it was sort of the old analogy of you know, being in the train business rather than being in the transportation business. So what I feel is that hand washing, hand hygiene is just a process. It's not an outcome. And if it isn't working, we got to figure out new ways to use those old tools. And frankly, right now, I'm not sure it's working, because we have become so concerned about monitoring hand hygiene. A lot of the reason is because we're mandated to do it, that we really forget that unless it's making a difference in the outcome, let's not get focused on these processes. Let's reinvent it in a new way. So I did want to say that I was just curious to see, because really when we started doing a lot of research in the 90s in hand hygiene, how much was actually being published at that time. So I went through APIC, and I looked at articles that had either hand washing or hand hygiene in the title. So in the entire decade of the 1990s, there were 16 articles in APIC on hand hygiene. In the 2000s, there were 83 in the entire decade. And in the last 2.5 years in APIC, there are 80. Wow. So there's a huge, you know, resurgence of interest. But we've got to move now beyond just, you're supposed to do this, we're going to do an in-service, and we've got to really change the whole culture. And that is hard. It takes a long time. And if we don't invent this tool in a new way, we're going to get angry, we're going to get depressed, and we're not going to be effective.
Yeah, no. That Very, very true. Very, very true. And I know some of your buds here are partners in crime in, in this process. Carla has contributed a lot in the beginning of your work, really sparked by identifying device-related infections. And I'm wondering if you can share a little insight into that process and how your story got started.
Thank you. Good morning. I think it's still morning, isn't it?
Yes, yeah.
I actually came into infection prevention, infection control as a fluke. My husband got a job at the University of Wisconsin as an assistant professor, and back in those days in the 70s, you were the wife, therefore you looked for work when you got to wherever you were going. There were no dual hires back then. So I was interviewed by a young physician who had just arrived at the University of Wisconsin from Harvard. And I am not a nurse, by the way. For those of you who do not know, I am a microbiologist originally. And he said, I already have a nurse. And indeed, because she hired him, the great Rita McCormick hired Dennis Mackey. I was Dennis Mackey's first hire. And he said, we're going to work on nosocomial infection. And I couldn't get out of there fast enough to look up what it was. I had no clue, but I thought, well, this could be fun. He seems nice. We were all in one room. My desk was the top of the specimen freezer. So when you had to get a specimen, I had to clear my desk. As it turns out, that was a forcing function probably I would use today to keep my desk clean. Oh. But in saying that, I was very interested in devices and the microbiology associated with devices, and we were doing a lot of IV research and things like that, so I got to do the medical microbiology I enjoyed. Pretty soon then I moved out onto the floor with Rita and learned about infection prevention from the nursing and clinical side, which was just great. In the process, endoscopes came into vogue, the flexible endoscope. Mm-hmm. And we bought, because we're big into equipment, we bought some automated endoscope reprocessors, the scope machines, as you would commonly call it. And one morning at a staff meeting, Mackey said, so how are those machines? I said, beats me. I don't know. I never go to the GI clinic. And he said, well, why don't you go check on them? So I went down and I took the obligatory samples and brought them back. And they were filled with Pseudomonas aeruginosa. And then I went and I tested our scopes, and they were filled with Pseudomonas aeruginosa. And then we started to look back in the microbiological specimens, and guess what? Patients, especially that had had ERCP, were filled with Pseudomonas aeruginosa. And I delved into it. I called the company. The company said, I think it's a Wisconsin problem. Okay, we'll go with that. And this is first take-home message. Never throw away your isolates. Always hang on to them, because you may find a use for them in an outbreak. And secondly, meet people here this week, because you never know when they will come back into your lives and play a significant role. I called colleagues across the United States and asked if they had problems, and because they had the same reprocessing machines. And they said, gee, I don't know. Maybe we do, I don't know. They took samples, and they had organisms in the machines. And at the time, it was at large medical centers, you saved your bloodborne isolates, your bacteria associated with bacteremias and septicemias, you save them. I don't know if people do now. I'm out of the day-to-day practice. Yeah. But then they did. And this could not happen today, I don't think, without having some sort of federal mandate. But they mailed me their bacteria. They put them in transport media, in tubes, and they sent patient A, patient B, patient C, machine 1, 2, 3, they sent them to me. And what we came upon was not only a nationwide, but a worldwide outbreak associated with these automated endoscope reprocessing devices. They were poorly designed from a microbiological standpoint because they were designed by engineers that knew nothing about infection prevention and microbiology. And that began my career in a way to try and understand a systems approach, which, as some of you know, I later went and got a PhD in systems engineering, and that's sort of my focus now. But without the help of the APIC colleagues that were willing to send me their isolates, I might have taken the answer, it's a Wisconsin problem. But it turned out to be a California problem, a Minnesota problem, a Washington State problem. It was everywhere they sent me isolates. Yeah. They weren't all the same bug, because we went further, and due to Dr. Mackey's forethinking, we did genomic DNA testing. We started fingerprinting in our research lab. You know, we were sort of the CSI of infection prevention at the time. And the bugs were different throughout the country, but they were a dead-on fingerprint match between patients and machine. It was the first DNA source outbreak published in a major medical journal associated with devices. And I want to give a big thank you to Julia Garner and Bill Martone and the Decennial Group for publishing that. Because at the time, no journal would take that article because it talked about major manufacturing flaws. It is a different era now. Now we can talk about major manufacturing flaws, but that back then, no journal published it. But the CDC backed it, and they did it, and it was a great hour. And one other thing on APIC's side, CDC went out of the business of publishing guidelines for a period of time. APIC picked up the ball and filled that gap. And in the process, a professor from North Carolina, Bill Rutala, came on the scene with disinfection and sterilization. And he found that label claims on one very large supplier of sterile disinfectant did not perform to what they claimed. FDA wouldn't touch it. CDC couldn't touch it. It wasn't their role. But Rutala stood by the science, and APIC backed him and said, we go down if you go down, and we sail if you sail. And that, I think, was one of APIC's proudest hours, that they stood up, the product didn't work, and they backed Dr. Rutala, and we were an advocate for good science and good practice.
And you have a favorite rule, don't you?
Yes, I do have a favorite rule. And it, today, I think most of the associated device-related problems follow what I call the Jerry Maguire rule. Engineering design is quite good today. Testing is quite good today. We don't get a lot of manufacturing flaws today. But what we do get are two things. One, biofilm. We have a better understanding of biofilm associated with devices. And two, it's the Jerry Maguire rule. Show me the money. And when you see these outbreaks associated with devices, step back, take a systems look. Where are people cutting corners? Where are, as our movie this morning showed us, where are they reusing devices that shouldn't be reused? Where are, in the manufacturing process, people cutting corners or changing product manufacturing, changing good manufacturing practices to save money? Everyone is under time crunch and money crunch. Yeah. And where are the corners cut? Where are the mistakes, the latent errors in the system popping out? It's my Jerry Maguire rule. Show me the money. Yeah. And once you see the money, then you go where it may be part of the root cause. And a last message. When I presented the outbreak of endoscopes, the first place I was asked to present was to the FDA in Rockville, Maryland. And I was scared to death, because I had worked with Dennis Mackey when he had to go to trial based on that Abbott outbreak that he and the Boys of Summer, as I call them, that CDC group of Raymond, Goldman, and Mackey, and the late Don Mackle, and that whole group, they had to go to trial concerning this. And to say they were harassed would be an understatement. It was not a bright scene to be an EIS officer testifying in that trial. It was very difficult, and I didn't want this. I said, oh no, I'm frightened by this. And Mackie said, first of all, it's a different time, but just tell me this. Are you telling the truth? Is your science good? What are you afraid of? I leave this message for you. You're gonna have challenges out there, especially you first-timers, you newbies in the field. There will be challenges. Always remember, are you telling the truth? Is your science good? Then what are you afraid of? Thank you.
Oh, awesome. And I'd like an opportunity to thank our 90s difference makers, because clearly you can see how they have made a difference. Thank you so much. And we're now gonna go on to the last decade, the 2000s.
Americans awakened on January 1st, 2000 with a collective sigh of relief as alarm clocks, computers, and other technologies successfully navigated the leap to Y2K. In the first decade of the 21st century, America would witness the first African-American president, the first handheld music library, and the first Austrian bodybuilder to become the governor of California. Pink was mad, reality TV was the fad, Florida couldn't add, and Donald's hair was just bad. Healthcare was dramatically impacted by some of the worst disasters in American history, some of them natural and some of them not. Ideas about biomedical technology, electronic medical records, and the healthcare share of the GDP were growing. But so were workforce shortages, healthcare costs, and MDROs. While celebrities were dancing with the stars, Arjun Srinivasan, Sanjay Saint, and Denise Murphy were targeting zero healthcare-associated infections, and much like those who came before them, were having a profound impact on the effort to make patients safer. Arjun Srinivasan has conducted groundbreaking research in the areas of outbreak investigations and multi-drug-resistant gram-negative pathogens and antimicrobial use. In 2008, he assumed the medical directorship of the new CDC campaign called Get Smart for Healthcare, which is designed to improve the use of antimicrobials in patient healthcare facilities. Currently, Dr. Srinivasan is the Associate Director for Healthcare-Associated Infection Prevention Programs at the CDC, where his primary responsibilities include oversight and coordination of efforts to eliminate healthcare-associated infections. His research and investigative areas of concentration include outbreak investigations, infection control, multi-drug-resistant gram-negative pathogens, and antimicrobial use and resistance. Sanjay Saint is known for his research on enhancing patient safety by preventing healthcare-associated infection, translating research findings into practice, and medical decision-making, including cognitive errors. He has authored over 200 peer-reviewed papers, with over 60 appearing in the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, or the Annals of Internal Medicine. He has been a visiting professor at over 35 universities and hospitals in the United States and around the world, and has received several major teaching awards. Dr. Saint is a professor of medicine at the University of Michigan Medical School, director of the VA University of Michigan Patient Safety Enhancement Program, and a liaison to CDC's Healthcare Infection Control Practices Advisory Committee. Denise Murphy entered the field of infection prevention and control in 1981 and has been an epidemiologist in hospitals ranging from 100 to 1,200 beds in rural and urban settings. She is nationally and internationally known for her presentations and publications on establishing or redesigning infection prevention and patient safety services in the business of infection control, patient safety, and performance improvement. Ms. Murphy was APIC president in 2007 and recently led the development of the APIC Infection Preventionist Competency Model. Ms. Murphy continues her impact on infection prevention as Vice President for Quality at Mainline Health System in suburban Philadelphia and remains active in futures planning, leadership development, and global business strategy for infection prevention. The turn of the century brought with it new developments in television, style, and technology, among others. By the end of the decade, the threats of Y2K were starting to sound funny, but Denise Murphy, Sanjay Saint, and Arjun Srinivasan were on the front lines, ensuring that patients would be even safer by Y3K.
Awesome. Our 2000 decade difference makers. Arjun, I wanted to ask you, you've covered a number of areas in your career, and I'm wondering if you could share with us the growing connection between CMS and how it is impacting infection prevention.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think the decade of the 2000s saw a dramatic expansion of federal involvement in healthcare-associated infection prevention. You know, CDC had been in this for a very long time. But in the 2000s, you know, we really saw this growing national awareness, finally, that healthcare-associated infections were preventable and, in fact, unacceptable. And there was a greater and greater call on government entities to take a more active role in trying to enforce prevention of healthcare-associated infections. We saw the advent of state reporting mandates early in the decade. We saw consumers find their voice on the unacceptable nature of healthcare-associated infection and demand action from the government. And towards the end of the decade, we saw these transformative events happening at the federal level. The Government Accountability Office does an investigation in 2008 and calls on the federal government to enhance its coordination and oversight of healthcare-associated infection prevention. Led to the development of the Health and Human Services HAI Action Plan, which was launched in 2009. And that action plan then became the foundation of the inclusion in healthcare-associated infections within the Affordable Care Act. So with the passage of the Affordable Care Act, the Secretary of Health and Human Services was ordered by Congress and the President to implement the HHS Action Plan to take concrete steps to prevent healthcare-associated infections. And of course, that inclusion into value-based purchasing is what set the stage for the environment that we live in now, where healthcare-associated infections are publicly reportable at a national level on Hospital Compare. We're anticipating the development of pay for reporting and pay for performance with healthcare-associated infections. So these major transformative events that happened in the 2000s that I think changed the practice of infection prevention forever. I think we now live in a climate where infection prevention is more difficult to practice than it's ever been before. All of us are called on to meet new regulatory requirements that we have never had before, expanded reporting of healthcare-associated infections, demands for outcome. We're called upon to do all of that under pressures that are vastly different from anything we've had before. The number of interested stakeholders in what we do, the number of people who demand action, who want to know what we're doing and how we're doing it, is greater than ever before. So we're in a more challenging environment than ever before, but I would argue that we're also in a setting where the field of infection prevention is more important than it's ever been before. Yes. The nation and all of our patients are calling on all of us to guide the implementation of these mandates. It's fine to pass these regulations, but how do we implement them? How do we define infections? How do we find infections? That's us. We tell people how to do that. It's fine to have numbers for infection rates and standardized infection ratios, but what do those numbers mean? How do we use those numbers to guide prevention efforts? That's us. Yes. It's fine to talk about preventing infections, but how do we prevent infections? That's us. So I would argue that this is the time for us, for infection prevention, to redefine our field and to take this challenge that's been issued to us and to move it forward into the next decade.
Now, you actually have another area of focus that we heard on the video about antibiotic resistance and the multi-drug resistant organisms that are in all of our environments.
Right.
Could you just tell us briefly a little bit about that?
Absolutely, and I think that's the other area that's really transformed our field in the last decade. The 2000s were the era where MRSA became a household word, and now people are aware of carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, CRE, and NDM enzymes. And I think there's an awareness now that we're running out of antibiotics. We're running out of treatment for infections. So if you run out of treatment, what's left? Prevention. So now it's upon us. We now have the responsibility for tackling these multi-drug resistant organisms. If we don't prevent these infections from happening, if we don't do what we know works, if we don't find new ways to prevent the development and spread of these organisms, we are going to be in a situation where we can't treat infections, and we have to stand by and watch our patients suffer and die from infections that we know we can prevent because we can't treat them.
Wow. And Sanjay, it sounds like you talk about how patient safety started at the beginning of the decade. It really became that hot topic. How did that patient safety movement impact infection prevention? If you could expound on that a little more.
Sure, happy to, Kathleen. Well, November 29th, 1999 was a very important day, and it's when the Institute of Medicine released its report, "To Err is Human." And in it, the IOM estimated that up to 98,000 Americans die each year because of patient safety-related problems. Galvanized public attention, and even though, as Dr. Mackey said, the people in infection prevention had been focusing on patient safety, this now got the public's attention. But what's interesting about the IOM report, even though it was 223 pages, essentially only 2 pages were devoted to infection prevention. And those 2 pages were in Appendix E, as in easy to overlook. And as the decade progressed, things changed dramatically. Yes. Because even though the IOM report had only about 1% of its pages devoted to infection prevention, when you look at the major patient safety initiatives, the 100,000 Lives campaign, the CMS Do Not Pay list, and now the healthcare engagement networks, between 1/3 and 50% of these patient safety initiatives include HAI prevention. So, in fact, Bill Scheckler wrote in 2002 that infection prevention is the paradigm for patient safety, arguing that using standardized definitions, surveillance, benchmarking, evidence-based practice, and making sure those are used in everyday practice is what quality managers should also be doing to prevent non-infectious complications, such as DVT, falls, and delirium.
Well, I actually do get around the country a bit and to a lot of hospitals. And what I'm trying to figure out is, why are there some hospitals that really rock and nail the reduction of healthcare-acquired infections, and then there are others that are massive, and I'm sure you see this, are massively struggling with this. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, we've been trying to answer this exact same question as well, Kathleen, and a lot of it has to do with implementation science. I know that term has been used often this morning. It's an important one because it's also a science that emerged during the last decade. And it's a scientific study of trying to figure out, how do you go from the published literature and evidence-based guidelines and actually make sure that every patient gets what they should be getting. And what we have found is that there are some things that help implementation and help make sure that hospitals are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and other things that hurt those things. And fundamental to this is understanding that implementation consists of 2 key components. There's the technical, which would be the evidence-based guidelines, and then there's the socio-adaptive, which is the art, as Patty mentioned this morning. This is understanding how to change behavior, understanding the context and the culture and the microculture. And what we've seen is that what helps move things forward are collaboratives with leadership support, identification of committed champions, IPs, bedside nurses, healthcare epidemiologists, and others, using bundles and checklists. But on the flip side, there are barriers to using evidence-based practices. Yeah. And what we found is that there are certain individuals who are active resistors, that they do things the way they've always done. Why? Because it's always been done that way. And it tends to be surgeons and anesthesiologists, but...
Yeah. Let's just put it right out there.
And the other group of individuals at hospitals that we've also discovered that prevent the use of evidence-based practices are organizational constipators.
That's a great name.
Mid-level to high-level individuals who say the right things at meetings, but when push comes to shove, they don't do what they need to do to move things forward.
Yeah. Absolutely. And what you talk about, it's really about the culture of what we create in organizations. And Denise, my understanding is you've created a term called people bundles. And I'm wondering if you could expound on that a little bit.
Sure. So before I talk about people bundles, I just want to say that I have been blessed to be a member of so many incredible bundles of people. And so to those of you in the audience and those of you that are not here, I thank you so much. People bundles are simply a compilation of safety behaviors and tools that help enforce those safety behaviors that really are intentionally aimed at the prevention of human error. So for example, behaviors might be pay attention to detail or speak up for safety, and question and confirm. But tools to really help you speak up for safety are things like stop the line. So you see an empowered member of a healthcare team. It could be a unit secretary. It could be anyone that's seeing someone during a line insertion not use all of the elements of the evidence-based bundles that we have. And so people bundles are just those things that help empower people, but actually the word empowerment is used a lot and it's so important, but I think people need tools to really feel empowered and to be able to change behaviors. So that's what I refer to as people bundles. So in concert with the clinical bundles, in an environment or a culture where that is supported, we have seen organizations all over the country eliminate or nearly eliminate, certainly drops of 50, 70, 80% of preventable harm. And so it really does make a difference. We can't do it with the evidence-based measures alone. We have to really address what makes people create errors or what makes people not be able to comply with safety behaviors.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And in that concept of getting to zero, we hear that frequently. And it's a big part of infection preventionists' lives, and it's a big part of my life as a clinical nurse specialist. What do you mean? What do we mean by that concept, and how does that fit in? Is it a different kind of culture that's created?
I think it is definitely a different culture. And so back in the 1999 and 2000, APIC invited many of us who were in organizations where the culture was changing. And I remember one time standing in the OR with Stephanie Koenig, an infection preventionist at one of our BJC hospitals, and we were talking about the high rates of infections and what were we going to do to get them down to the CDC benchmark. And Stephanie looked at me and she said, wow, do you think anyone wants an infection? You know, should we really be talking about benchmarks? And I said, gosh, no. We really should be talking about zero, but nobody's going to go for that. You know, so that was, and then the language and what was more important is the evidence started to take hold. So across the country, people were seeing 18 months with no CLABSI. They were seeing 20 months with no sternal wound infection. And so we started to talk about it, but the language created conflict. So to the point that Patty Grant made this morning and that wonderful comment, thank you for sharing that, Patty, about conflict can lead to good things. The language creates culture, so we had to get the language right. But we were talking back then about zero tolerance.
Right.
And that created a lot of fear because people were afraid that zero tolerance for infections, it could end up in a punitive response from governmental agencies, accreditation agencies. So we pulled together in 2007, APIC, SHEA, CDC, the Joint Commission, the IHI, and many other groups to really see if we couldn't come up with a unified message. And what really turned the conversation for us was Dr. John Jernigan, who is from CDC and on the call with Denise Cardo. And he said, you know, why are we so afraid to use the word elimination? If we didn't use that word in the context of tuberculosis or HIV/AIDS, where would we be today? And I'm telling you, that really, really turned the whole conversation to targeting zero, not focusing on benchmarks, but targeting zero is absolutely where we have to go as a country and really in the world.
And so let me ask, from the healthcare practitioner perspective or the infection preventionist, how easy was that concept of elimination of, because there's this sense of ownership that I own infection?
Right, exactly. So a couple of culture changes here, and I'll just digress for a moment to a couple of early culture changes. In the early 2000s, we started talking about two things that were very different. We had our own culture in infection prevention and control. We were the data experts, right? And so we started challenging people to do two important things. One was to make the business case for infection prevention, to start to speak the language of healthcare executives, and to talk about infection prevention in the context of the business of healthcare, and to really convince executives why it was so important to invest in infection prevention. Many, many people across the country and across the world did that very well, got more of an investment, more resources, more focus on the important work of prevention. And because of that, those early leaders started to see zero infections. We had trouble believing it. And so we started seeing it happen everywhere. People stepped up to the plate, they began publishing it, and more people started to believe it. But the controversy continued. And I think why targeting zero is the language we fell on was because we know that we may not be able to eliminate every infection, every type of infection in every setting for every patient forever, but we can get infections to zero. We can sustain them for very long periods of time. We can empower our healthcare teams, and Sanjay talks a lot in his writings about leadership versus followership. And another big culture change for us as infection preventionists was to watch the other members of the healthcare team start to own infection prevention, and suddenly we were behind them. We were following them, but in our hands were the knowledge, the tools, the data, and the evidence. We were translating the research into knowledge at the bedside, and we were handing it off to them. And so there was the different partnership, and I think that incredible belief that as a team, we can really do this together. So I think that's been the message throughout the whole conference. It's really in all of our hands, but so much culture change has occurred, and it's been frightening but incredibly successful. So I thank all of the leaders that have made a difference and all of the people in the audience who are about to continue to move that forward.
And there is no question that the difference makers of the 2000s have made a huge impact in the direction, in the right direction, that we're moving forward in our clinical environments for our patients and for ourselves. So I want to thank you so much. And by the way, I'd like to, go ahead and stand up. I'd like to thank our difference makers that are here. I want everybody to give a rock and roll for all that they have done. Thank you so much. So you can go ahead and walk. Woo! It's amazing that all of that was 40 years. And it was, and you experienced it. Those 40 years of getting up early, having lunch at your desk, staying late, thinking about this over the weekend. 4 decades of data collection, surveillance, long meetings, phone calls. And as we celebrated these contributions and milestones as they've been highlighted, sometimes it's easy to forget that a lot of this came from that day-to-day dedication that you have and that you do to process and to understand, and your relentless pursuit of creating a safer healthcare environment. And guess what? 2013 has had no shortage of its own difference makers. You and your colleagues, your ability to, and that dedication has proven that infection prevention is way more than a job. So I want to introduce you to Susan and her colleagues from the Colorado Children's Hospital, who are some of our contemporary difference makers. Let's hear their story.
It was in the fall of 2010, and we get together at microbiology rounds every morning.
And we have a chance to interchange information.
We have an opportunity at micro rounds to sort of pull the whole picture together.
It was at one of those microbiology rounds where the lab staff reported that they had gotten a Bacillus cereus, an organism out of the blood of a particular patient.
And I can remember turning to Elaine in the microbiology lab and looking at her at rounds and saying, "That seems a little unusual."
It's a little bit unusual to see it in blood cultures.
It wasn't shortly thereafter that we actually had a patient who had an infection.
So I was aware of the first patient because of Susan talking about that patient at micro rounds.
And so I started just an investigation based specifically on that one case, but knowing in the back of my head that there were a couple others that didn't make sense.
I believe the epidemiology team were looking at the charts, at the patient charts, to see what the commonalities were, but many of the patients were so complicated, it was really hard to tell.
One weekend, I was checking my email. There was a patient who was up on the floor.
And this patient was not a complicated patient like the first patient. So I sent Susan an email and said, I think I have a simpler patient who maybe has the same thing, and then you, because she's such a good detective, will be able to figure out the situation.
I started my line list and started looking at patients who had this organism in their blood.
And so she's the one who then tried to put those two patients together and physically, went up and said, where was this patient located? Where was their IV?
And within just a day, she had identified a number of possible fomites that could have transmitted this organism to the patient.
She came in with an armful of products, and she sort of laid them out on the table and said, we need to culture all these things.
And by Wednesday morning, they shared with us
that what appeared to be the same organism was in these alcohol pads that people use all over the world, thinking that they're sterile. But in fact, they're not labeled as sterile.
So that launched the investigation.
Within days, she recalled all of the alcohol pads in the hospital, which is a monumental task.
At the same time, we were also notifying the health department.
When Susan called us, she had so much information.
And they in turn notified the CDC and also the FDA.
The fact that alcohol pads were even considered, I was very impressed, because bacteria aren't supposed to grow in alcohol pads. Why would you ever think that they would be contaminated?
They actually halted production after some period of time, and alerts went out
saying that non-sterile alcohol pads should not be used for patient care, that this really needed to be sterile alcohol pads that were being used.
And there was a lot of questioning and commotion over this, and a lot of angst by infection control people in their facility. The information they were receiving wasn't all that extensive, and it takes time, and we were planning to publish our work, but that takes time to go through that process and have things reviewed, and eventually got something put out through the CDC that gave more to that story, and then eventually published it in one of our peer-reviewed journals.
I will tell you that on that day, in microbiology rounds, I would have let that bacillus pass, but she didn't.
And I feel like I am one of the luckiest people to have been, that first of all, they thought I was able to do this job, and that they would teach me the qualities of being an epidemiologist in infection control and prevention, and they have been the most wonderful mentors for me. I couldn't ask to work with better people than the people I work with here. I'm Susan Dolan.
My name is Elaine Dowell.
My name is Jim Todd.
My name is Wendy Bamberg.
My name is Mimi Glaudet.
I'm honored to be an infection preventionist.
And I'm a difference maker.
And I am a difference maker.
And I'm a difference maker.
And I am a difference maker.
And I am a difference maker.
By the way, guys, Susan is right here up front. You want to stand for a second? Oh, come on, stand up. It's awesome. What Susan and her colleagues did, they really have put themselves on the infection prevention timeline. That may be up here 40 years from now, right? Telling about that story. And that's our challenge for you today, is really think about how it's your turn now to impact the profession with things that could be felt 40 years from now. So how are we going to do it? In your conference bag, and if you can find it, there is a journal. And it was put there for a very specific reason, so that as you attend various conferences and workshops, it's really about identifying those opportunities that are within your circle of influence and your responsibility. And because when you think about the difference makers we had up here in Susan's story, these guys all had a choice, didn't they? In their job, in their work environments, they could have seen it as a job, hung out in the status quo, in the midst of all of these opportunities. But when they were faced with a choice to just hang or a choice to act, they chose action. And that's why we're here today. And so as you sit down and listen, or even stand and listen throughout the next couple of days, think about those opportunities, write those action steps in your journals so that when you get back to your hospitals, you're going to have a plan to get started. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so it's really about, sometimes we have to step out of that comfort zone. So as Patty charged, meet new people. And Karen said this as well. Get out of your comfort zone. Challenge yourself as a part of this process. So, have you had fun? Yes. Have you learned? Yeah. We've laughed, we've reminisced. We've also felt emotion. But most of all, I believe we felt inspiration. And this celebration was about celebrating, but it was also about being a catalyst, because it is your turn to take the time on the infection prevention timeline. Are you going to be a difference maker? I hope so, as a part of it. I so thank you for your attention and for your passion and commitment and dedication that will show a difference 40 years from now. Because I've got to tell you something, what we are all doing, it takes that courage. And if it's not about this, what's it going to be about? And if it's not about now, when is this going to happen? And if it's not about me, who's it going to be? So really take the message home with you and think about being that difference maker in your environment.